My name is Fareed Khan. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Media Relations for the Rohingya Human Rights Network, and I'd like to welcome all of you here on behalf of the Rohingya Human Rights Network. Also joining me today are Senator Mary Lou McPhedran, Independent Senator for the province of Manitoba, Aziza Kanji, legal academic and journalist, Dr. Alia Khan, Chair of the humanitarian organization Canadians in Support of Refugees in Dire Need, Kyle Matthews, who is the Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide Studies at McGill University. And joining us a little later will be Professor John Packer, Director of the University of Ottawa's Human Rights Research and Education Center. Unfortunately, Professor Packer has a conflict this morning, which is why he'll be joining us a bit later. So I'd like to begin by pointing out that yesterday was the International Day of Remembrance for the Victims of Genocide, and today, December 10th, is International Human Rights Day. These 2 days commemorate the anniversaries of the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, two of the foundational United Nations documents that Canada helped to draft, documents which the Canadian government is supposed to uphold and defend. But the international legal order and the human rights of vulnerable minorities underpinned by these two documents are under assault by oppressive regimes like never before. It's now 3 years since the atrocities against the Rohingya were committed by Myanmar, and we have to question Canada's commitment to stand behind these two UN instruments and whether the Canadian government truly cares about stopping genocide despite its public statements to the contrary. As a nation that was an architect of the post-World War II legal order, it would seem logical that Canada would be one of the countries to ensure the enforcement of these documents. In fact, Canadians have often heard Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his ministers state that Canada is a rule of law nation, that it supports the international legal order, and that it's a defender of human rights. But such claims are just political rhetoric devoid of meaning if there's no action to back them up. In reality, the Canadian government has repeatedly failed to live up to its legal obligations under the Genocide Convention and the Declaration of Human Rights. It has failed to uphold in any concrete fashion the international legal order which it claims to defend. And it's playing politics with the lives of persecuted and brutalized people like the Rohingya, the Uyghurs in China, Kashmiris in India-occupied Kashmir, and Palestinians under Israeli occupation. Since the fall of 2017, when stories of the atrocities were front-page news, we and other Canadian human rights activists called on the Trudeau government to invoke the Genocide Convention and designate Myanmar's crimes as genocide. For 3 years, we joined our parliamentary and human rights allies to repeatedly implore the federal government to file a case at the International Court of Justice against Myanmar for its genocidal crimes. We called on the government to prove that Canada lives up to its international treaty obligations and to show that Canada's commitment to defend human rights were not just empty words. However, our appeals have continually fallen on deaf ears and makes a lie of the government's repeated claims that Canada is a rule of law nation and defender of the international legal order. The proof of that is the Canadian government's disregards for its responsibilities under the UN instruments and protocols to which Canada is a state party. When Canada did finally become the first nation to officially recognize the Rohingya genocide by unanimous resolutions in the House of Commons and Senate, a full year after the atrocities against the Rohingya began, it did nothing more to hold Myanmar accountable. This was despite repeated calls by parliamentarians, human rights scholars, activists, and members of the Canadian Rohingya community to do so. By recognizing the Rohingya genocide and as a state party to the Genocide Convention, Canada was legally required to act to try to stop it, to help prevent its recurrence, and to pursue legal action at the ICJ to hold Myanmar accountable. But to its utter shame, the Canadian government took none of these actions. The Trudeau government also refuses to admit its hypocrisy of claiming to be a defender of human rights and the international legal order while doing little to nothing to defend it. It adds to that hypocrisy every year by intoning the mantra "Never Again" on Human Rights Day, Victims of Genocide Remembrance Day, and Holocaust Remembrance Day. During a year which marks the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz death camp, the 25th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, and the 75th anniversary of the UN itself, it's well past time for the Trudeau government to put up or shut up on matters of defending human rights and the international rule of law. Personally, I'm tired of the political platitudes and posturing when it comes to taking action to defend human rights and stop mass atrocities and genocide targeting minority communities. And I can't even imagine how the people who are targeted by these atrocities feel. So after 3 years of repeatedly asking, after 3 years of frustration, we asked the Canadian government once again to fulfill its legal obligations under the Genocide Convention and either fully join the Rohingya genocide case currently before the ICJ or file a separate case. We also asked the Canadian government to take legal action against those Canadian companies, business executives, and individuals who continue to do business with Myanmar's genocidal regime in violation of Canadian and international law. Furthermore, we call on the Canadian government to do the humane thing and renew Canada's humanitarian aid commitment to Rohingya refugees of $300 million over 3 years after the current commitment expires in March 2021. Frankly, if Justin Trudeau truly wants Canada to be a leader on the international stage, then he needs to demonstrate that Canada is more than just a paper tiger when it comes to defending the international rule of law and protecting human rights, and he needs to drop his government's political rhetoric and PR spin on matters of life and death. Human rights are just that, human rights. All humans, regardless of who they are, where they live, or what their identity is, need to be defended against those who would violate their rights and commit atrocities against them simply for existing. And the perpetrators of atrocities against vulnerable minority communities need to be held accountable. It's not just a right and moral thing to do, it's the human thing to do. Because to do otherwise would be to abandon our humanity, destroy any hope of justice for Rohingya genocide survivors, and lie to ourselves about Canada's moral standing on the world stage. I would now like to call Senator Mary Lou McPhedran to join us and present her remarks.
Thank you very much, Fareed. May I just check that you can hear me okay? Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. My remarks will probably sound somewhat different in tenor from Fareed because there have been some announcements about Canada and the Netherlands being prepared to take steps together, which I see as a very positive development in that in some ways the skill set and the number of people in the Netherlands who have strong capabilities for carrying forward a case of this nature and actions of this nature make them a very strong partner for Canada. It has been some time since Canada has taken this kind of intervention on the international stage. We are well positioned to do this. We were the very first country in the world to have both houses of our parliament agree on a motion urging the government of Canada 3 years ago to take action. We have the opportunity to extend significant and adequate funding to organizations that are on the ground in the Rohingya communities, in the Rohingya camps in both Bangladesh and Myanmar. And we have strong non-governmental organizations that are Canadian-based that have been doing good work with refugees, with Rohingya, again, in Myanmar and in Bangladesh. And this is our opportunity for Canada to extend decent funding, adequate funding that allows this work to continue, because if it doesn't continue, we will not be in a position to make our best possible contributions to the case at the International Court of Justice. I think we also want to urge the Canadian government to clarify what it is that has been promised. Will there be an intervention led by Canada, or even better, co-led with the Netherlands and perhaps other countries that are signatories and have ratified the Genocide Convention? It is really as much a question of sharing information about what is now going on and how what is under development is consistent with our existing commitment of feminist foreign policy for international development, and to the point, which I hope won't sound too legalistic, but this is a huge case for the entire world that is before the International Court of Justice alleging genocide on the part of Myanmar. And only one country so far is carrying the burden of that case. It really is time for Canada and the Netherlands to step forward and confirm participation, full participation. The provisional remedies decision of the International Court of Justice was unanimous, which is a very good thing. But what is very concerning about that decision, and yes, it is provisional, it is tentative, the case has years more to go on, is that not even one full sentence addressed the extensive evidence, both anecdotal from survivors and other forms of evidence has been gathered, of the systematic genocidal actions with the use of sexualized gender-based violence directed against Rohingya women, girls, and to some extent Rohingya men and boys. And the fact that that was missing from the court's judgment, tentative judgment, tells us that the evidence wasn't presented enough or adequately. And this is specifically something that Canada can do, does well. We have the resources to do it. We have the policy and the international commitment, the framework that is necessary to do it. So I'm here today, not so much to condemn the Canadian government. I'm here, though, to thank everyone in the Canadian government, including members of the opposition parties and the many senators that have signed on to urging the government to take action. I'm here to say we need more information. We need to know what is actually going to be done and what is underway, and to have confirmation that what we are doing in support of the Rohingyas on the ground, in the camps, in the communities, in Myanmar and Bangladesh, and what we are doing in the International Court of Justice, that this is consistent with feminist foreign policy. This is consistent with giving voices directly to the Rohingyas who have survived and whose voices need to be heard. And that's what we're investing in. And that's where we're using our expertise. And we're not going to stay on the sidelines. We are going to be a party in the Genocide Convention and use everything that we have in order to make this the strongest possible case. Because without strong evidence, without the voices of Rohingya, this case will be at risk, and it cannot be left only to one country to carry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. I would now like to ask Aziza Kanji to please turn on your mic and camera and present your remarks.
Thank you, Fareed. The Canadian government's strong words about the genocide being perpetrated by the Myanmar regime against the Rohingya people are appreciated. However, these words must be accompanied by concrete action commensurate with the gravity and urgency of the situation. Actions at both the international level, which my colleagues at this press conference have and will address, but also at the domestic level with respect to Canadian actors and organizations. And so we have to ask, why have Canadian corporations been supplying the propaganda arm of the Myanmar military with communications equipment so unabashedly that these sales are openly announced in trade publications? Why are Canadians' public pension funds invested in corporations doing extensive business with the genocidal Myanmar military, as reported recently by the Globe and Mail? Why were Canadians and Canadian-backed international organizations involved in developing a racist Myanmar election app that perpetuated the racist, genocidal hate speech of the Myanmar regime by labeling Rohingya candidates as Bengalis? What scrutiny is being applied to Canadian mining corporations operating in Myanmar, mining being a known primary stream of enrichment for the Myanmar military? What measures have been adopted to ensure that garments manufactured in Tatmadaw-owned facilities linked to global fashion brands around the world are not being sold in Canadian stores? These questions are not only about Myanmar's legal and moral obligations, but about Canada's legal and moral obligations. As we know from research from the UN's Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar and other respected international organizations, genocide does not occur in a vacuum. It is sustained and enabled by a far-reaching web of economic, political, social, and military relationships. And so, we urge and expect the Canadian government to ensure full divestment from the Myanmar military's economic empire, and to ensure that no Canadian entities are enabling or enriching this genocidal regime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aziza, for your remarks. I would now like to call on Dr. Alia Khan to present her remarks.
Thank you very much, Fareed, and also to my colleagues who have made important points. I'd like to just remind everybody that today on the International Human Rights Day, we have to remember that it was August the 25th, 2017, that the Myanmar military began a massive on the Rohingya people with machete attacks, widespread burnings of villages, hundreds of villages, and slaughter and beheadings of men, women, and children. And as Senator Mary Lou McPhedran has said, mass gang rapes of women and children occurred, and rape was used as a weapon of genocide. And the Rohingya people fled from Myanmar to Bangladesh on foot. And the people arriving in those had second and third degree burns, bullet wounds. They were young girls who had been raped by military. And these people have been living in crowded camps with no access to clean water, food. The pregnant women and girls delivered in those camps under horrific conditions. They have experienced the greatest torment, the greatest torture, physical, mental, psychological, emotional. Human trafficking continues to be a major concern in those camps, and the world is watching, and there is unfortunately very, very little action. And it's time for us to take action. At the International Court of Justice, the Gambia has filed a claim of genocide against Myanmar. Canada has issued a joint statement with the Netherlands expressing their joint intention to intervene. And this was in September 2019. And beyond that, very little has happened. And every day lives are being lost. Canada is a state party to the Genocide Convention and is committed to a rules-based international order. And we ask Canada to act and to lead in seeking justice for the Rohingya victims of genocide. And we specifically ask Canada to act and to request that the International Court of Justice make public the reports on the case. The process of justice has to be observed, especially by the victims of this genocide. That's number one. Number two, we ask Canada to become a party and stand with the Gambia in seeking justice. Number three, we ask Canada to use diplomacy to encourage other states to support the International Court of Justice. And number four, we are very concerned about the transfer of Rohingya people to the Bhasan Char Island. This is an isolated island in the Bay of Bengal. It is dangerous. It is subject to submersion and cyclones, and it is not suitable for human habitation. And Rohingya people are being transferred to this island, despite the concerns of the UN and humanitarian aid organizations who have expressed grave concern. And this has to be halted. Canada is a global leader and represents justice and the importance of speaking up for those who are oppressed and persecuted. And we ask Canada to lead the world now, as Canada is needed on the global scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alia, for those impassioned remarks. I would now like to call on Kyle Matthews from the Montreal Institute for Genocide Studies to present his remarks.
Thank you, Fareed. Thank you, everyone. Today, I think that to honor Human Rights Day, we can do that to honor Human Rights Day by protecting and seeking justice for the Rohingya. I think if you look at right now, with the pandemic, with multiple other crises taking place, it's very easy for countries to forget about the Rohingya, who, as was mentioned, just 3 years ago, over 700,000 were forced at gunpoint using sexual violence to ethnically cleanse them and push them into Bangladesh. It's very easy for countries to start turning inwards. We have economic challenges. We can't travel. But I would like to urge that the Canadian government, Canadian society, Canadian civil society organizations do the opposite, that we embrace the case of the Rohingya and make it a national project for Human Rights Day. And as was mentioned by previous speakers, is that they need protection and justice. For example, protection. We mentioned that over 700,000 refugees have now been for over 3 years in crowded, unsanitary camps in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is not a very wealthy country, so it's very challenging for it to take care of the Rohingya. So there is an additional need to continue providing humanitarian assistance to help those people there. But there's also another troubling element. That troubling element is that, as mentioned, is that some refugees are now being sent to a remote island in the Bay of Bengal that is not suitable for human habitation and that is prone to all sorts of cyclones and storms. And it's a troubling situation in which the High Commissioner for Refugees just this week made it clear to the government of Bangladesh that people can only go there if it's voluntary. I think we need to keep an eye on this and really focus on that. Another issue is that there are still 600,000 Rohingya in Myanmar, and we don't really know what's happened to them. It's very hard for humanitarian actors, human rights groups to travel to where they are. There's fear about what has happened to them. We just don't know. So there has to be continued efforts to open up Myanmar and have people be able to travel and see what's happening. And why I say that? Well, we just had the Myanmar elections, and those 600,000 Rohingya were not allowed to vote. So they're being disempowered and disenfranchised and unable to participate in society. That's a warning sign. And I would also remind everyone that the genocide, these atrocity crimes are not over. Just because half the population has fled to Bangladesh doesn't mean that the crime is over. It could still be going on right now. So we need to push this and work with our partners. I do think it would be very useful for the Canadian government with the Netherlands and other allies to support Gambia at the International Court of Justice. I think it would send an overwhelmingly strong message. And I think we would be able to, if we tried diplomatically, to get other actors on board, other countries from the Muslim world and other democracies. And I think also at the UN itself, on top of providing funding to UN agencies that are working in the humanitarian sector to help give life-saving assistance to the Rohingya, there's also other mechanisms. There's a UN, Nicholas Koumjian, who is the head of the UN Independent Mechanism for Myanmar. We need to be supporting this mechanism and the staff that are collecting evidence for eventual prosecution. And I might just close my last statement in saying, one of the key things and Canada has shown leadership a lot more than many other countries, but one very interesting thing that Canada did and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did was appoint Bob Rae as a special envoy for this human rights issue. Now, Ambassador Ray is now at the UN in New York as an ambassador, but it would be a very useful move to perhaps appoint a new special envoy for Myanmar that would be able to help position Canada and work with our allies to protect the Rohingya on Human Rights Day. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Kyle. I'd now like to call Professor John Packer, who has joined us from the Human Rights Research and Education Center in the University of Ottawa. I'm sorry, John, we're not getting good sound from you. No, we're not hearing you. At least I'm not hearing you. Sorry, could you try turning your mic on?
Is it working now?
Oh, much better, much better. Thank you.
Okay, I just changed the system of mics.
Okay.
Thanks, Fareed, for organizing and hosting this, and for my co-panelists in the presentation. I have to say that on behalf of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa, it is disappointing that more than 3 years since the events of 25 August 2017, we are coming together again to call upon the Government of Canada to do not just steps which morally it should be compelled to take, but which are actually its legal obligations under the Genocide Convention. And let me just underline that we are speaking here about an ongoing, visible, foreseeable genocide. 2.5 million Rohingya have fled their country over the last decades through what has been called a slow burning genocide prior to the 25 August 2017 events, which only exacerbated and were a final clearance operation, to use the words of the Myanmar military. And that means that about 85% of Rohingya are already basically gone from their homeland and are living in precarious situations. About 1.5 million in in Bangladesh, which was just pointed out is a country that for a long time was amongst the least developed and hardly able to support them. So this is an urgent and existential matter, and it does not appear that the steps taken by our government either meet their international obligations or are commensurate with that sense of urgency and necessity to act. So let me join my voice with the others who have called for precise steps by the Government of Canada. Let me say that what I will just comment upon here in respect of the International Court of Justice action alone is entirely within not just the competence, but the reach of Canada as a government, as a G7 member state, easily to take these steps. There is no obstacle, domestic or international, barring Canada from taking these steps. I will just reiterate that we join others in calling for the demand for public disclosure of the reporting documentation before the court under this public interest case of genocide against the Rohingya. This is a case there's 153 member states parties to the Genocide Convention, but actually genocide is an obligation applying to everyone. Therefore, it's of interest to everyone. It's at the foundation of our global system, of its prohibition as part of the whole United Nations system. So it's a very straightforward thing to say that the justice to be done must be seen to be done, and these must be public documents. But above all, the Rohingya must know. The case as it's being litigated at the moment between two states is an antiquated 19th century approach to almost a proprietary matter where the Rohingya as victims are an object in dispute. They have no standing, they are not given any voice, and at the moment, no visibility on even what is being talked about them or pled about them. That is shameful and really it represents a kind of audacity on the part of the system and those powerful people who are now considering what to do about the Rohingya victims. And the world needs to see this. The world needs to hold to account the government of Myanmar and the perpetrators. And the Rohingya need to have active presence and, first of all, knowledge. So it's a very simple thing to call for. There is no bar to this. It simply needs to be requested. Canada, with other states, should call for the public disclosure of all the documentation. There's no excuse not to do that. The second point is that Canada should actively join the case. To issue a statement on a piece of paper, one paragraph or two, saying that we intend to intervene without even declaring what kind of intervention and implying that that will be a long time coming and will be a moderate and not as a party without all the possibilities that are available to Canada in the case, is really to opt for about the least that we could possibly do on this case. This is, again, really lamentable. Whispers have been made, including nonsense that Canada fears to be seen as neo-colonialist in this regard. Let me just underline that the Gambia, when they announced their engagement, actually asked, their vice president of the United Nations General Assembly called upon all states to join them in the case. The Rohingya have repeatedly asked states, including Canada directly, please join expressly, become a party in the case. That request is still being asked. And I want to underline again that Canada has a duty, once that it declared that there's genocide under Article 19 of the Genocide Convention, it stipulates that the state, such a state shall bring the matter to the International Court of Justice. And Canada is capable of doing that. Again, there is no excuse not to do it. And finally, this idea of mobilizing through Canadian diplomacy, where we have reach and capacity, unlike tiny Gambia, which has one representative in all of Southeast Asia, so is simply not capable of mobilizing at the United Nations, cannot even fund its own case. It's now it's got the hat being passed to OIC member states. It's not clear it will raise the funds. This is frankly ridiculous. The government of Canada needs to stop dawdling. It needs to, it's looking like it's uncertain what it's supposed to be doing, and it's increasingly appearing weak. Canada should lead diplomatically, should be mobilizing actively, and we call upon Canada, therefore, to do these three easily available steps. Call for the public disclosure of all the documentation at the court, join the case, that's issue a single statement saying we will apply and join the case, and third of all, mobilize the diplomacy. That will raise the matter and will inspire and frankly, be appropriate in respecting the will and the needs of the Rohingya people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I'd now like to ask all the participants to please turn on your cameras and microphones. We do have a number of media in the room. If there are any questions, as I mentioned at the beginning, please state the media outlet that you're representing, your name, and your question. Please use the Q&A function in this chat to present your questions. In the meantime, while we wait, I'm just wondering if there was anything that we did not get to that any of the presenters would like to raise now that we have some time. I guess hearing nothing, I guess we covered it all. Seeing as we have no questions from the media, if there are others who are in the room who would like to ask a question, please feel free to once again use the Q&A function in the program, in the Zoom program, to please present your question.
Fareed?
Yes.
Senator McPhedran here.
Yes, go ahead.
I'd just like to offer a clarification on how it is that Canada is taking some steps, but we don't know what they are. And I want to emphasize that our remarks today really need to be directed to two ministers in the Canadian government, to our Justice Minister, David Lametti, and to our Minister for Foreign Affairs, Champagne. And that this is a joint action if Canada is going to truly step up and be a party under the Genocide Convention before the International Court of Justice, we will need to have resources that are deployed by both Global Affairs and Justice Canada, and we need to know what is actually being done. Promises have been made, announcements have been made. We have a very strong partner with the Netherlands, and in order to bring the kind of public disclosure that most of the speakers this morning have said is so important about the case, we cannot know how best to respond and how to use resources and how to bring the voices of Rohingya survivors of this genocide unless there is public disclosure of what is available now from the International Court of Justice. And we will not be able to take effective action unless Canada steps up to be a party to this action. And so today, really, I would recommend that those who want to know the answer need to direct the questions to Ministers Lametti and Champagne. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Senator. John, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'd just like to underline, what is possible here. Of course, we support strongly Canada's repeated commitment to uphold a rules-based order to support specifically human rights. But we have to then look at that in this context. And by reference to the shared statement with the Netherlands, let me just draw your attention to the fact that the Netherlands right now has brought an interstate complaint against the Russian Federation for the shooting down of MH17 flight in Ukraine, the Malaysian Airlines. So that's taking the matter to the proper body, in that case, the European Court of Justice. The Netherlands has also announced it will bring Syria to the International Court of Justice under the Torture Convention. I believe it was the Torture Convention for a breach of that multilateral convention. So they are simply acting because it's absolutely available. And I would argue legally, it is in fact the responsibility of states parties to uphold these instruments. So Canada is a party to the Genocide Convention. And not only we should act as such, but we have, by unanimous decision of both houses of our parliament, including the personal vote of our current Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, the Prime Minister, and many other members of the government who voted for that resolution declaring genocide. That actually means we are obliged to bring the matter under the convention. So we have to ask ourselves, with all the capability, all the knowledge, all the resources Canada has and its commitment, why is it soft pedaling? Why is it not doing all that it can? It should be acting with the full capacity and determination to pursue this matter as it is actually obliged to do. So these questions, which the Senator correctly points out, must be addressed to the two ministers and to the Prime Minister, but the two ministers who are jointly involved with their staff really leaves me breathless almost 3.5 years later to understand why this has not proceeded as it should.
Would anyone else like to add their comments? Aziza, Alia, Kyle?
If I could just make comments. We've seen recently parliaments around the world embrace Magnitsky sanctions. There's been some action by the European Union, by the Americans and Canadians on this, but I think this is a policy instrument. So going beyond the justice aspect of trying to seek justice for the Rohingya, we might want to see how we can use targeted economic sanctions against individuals in the government if they will not open up and allow UN observers to Rakhine State to see what's happening to the Rohingya who are there, who are probably internally displaced under tremendously difficult situation. I think that's a policy tool that could be brought out by multiple countries simultaneously to bring about some change in the situation.
I would like to.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Aziza, and then Alia, please.
I would like to underscore some of the other points made about the ICJ by emphasizing the degree to which the Rohingya have so far been excluded from the process. I was present at the International Court of Justice for the provisional measures hearings. The vast majority of the Rohingya were not even allowed space inside the courtroom. Instead, they were forced to protest outside, confronted by defenders of the regime that is engaged in genociding them. They have actively been denied their requests for access to the provisional measures reports when they are the very people who are best placed to assess the veracity of Myanmar's claims about the measures it has implemented in pursuance of the provisional measures decision. The proceedings at the ICJ have not even been broadcast in the language of the Rohingya, and so they are unable even to understand the words that are being spoken about the genocide that they have experienced. If the central logic of genocide is the logic of erasure, it is extremely disturbing that the Rohingya have continued to be erased in the process of the very international legal system that is meant to ensure justice for the genocide that they have experienced. And so it is vital that Canada pursue the most robust form of intervention possible at the ICJ in order to best advance the representation and agency of the Rohingya who for so long have been denied it. Thank you.
Go ahead, Alia.
Yes, I just wanted to add to the comments that were made that a large percentage of the Rohingya who are still trapped inside Myanmar, we are very concerned about them. We have no knowledge of how they are being treated. Girls, women being used as sex slaves, the torture, the persecution is significant. And the fact that international human rights monitors have not been allowed access to them is of grave concern. And I think that Canada has to raise these issues urgently at the UN level. And as we mentioned, work with states who are like-minded, who have value for international law to speak up, because now is the time to speak up. It really reflects the global situation that a genocide can happen in full view and everyone is silent. It's just shocking, actually.
Yes, and I'd like to add to that as well, because this is the most clear-cut case of genocide that we've seen in recent times. It's been presented at the ICJ, and while we're trying to muddle through this essentially in terms of the way Canada's actions have been presented, we are now seeing things happening in other countries. What China is doing to the Uyghurs with full-fledged concentration camps, people, having their children taken away from them. What India is doing in Kashmir, what's happening in other parts of the world as well. And the thing is, if we can't, if the international community, Canada and its allies, and those who claim to defend democracy and human rights, can't get their act together on this clear-cut case of genocide, how is it going to address these other peoples where atrocities are being committed? What I see from the way Canada has presented itself as being a champion of human rights, but then doing very little or the least possible to actually defend those human rights, it's basically, telling other nations to say, hey, look, we can get away with these acts and these atrocities because no one's really going to come after us. Sorry, John, were you going to say something before?
I just wanted to emphasize, as Alia and Kyle and others have mentioned, with regard to the, we're not actually sure how many Rohingya remain back in Myanmar and specifically in Rakhine State. We know very little because there is an ongoing blackout of information. There is now an armed conflict that has been raging. Bits of information come out, and those bits of information are deeply disturbing. Attacks, killings, ongoing atrocities. But what we do know, confirmed by the international community, particularly High Commission for Refugees and others, there remains at least 125,000 in an internment camp around Sitwe in awful conditions where they've been for many years, simply wasting away in their homeland. This has not changed. So this is, in my view, clearly contrary to the provisional measures. So what we do know, the little bit we do know, is awful. And it is reasonable to draw the worst conclusions that these are the final steps of erasure. The villages and towns which were razed to the ground, with business enterprises are being simply rebuilt or overtaken. Property rights have been transferred. So this is ongoing, and it needs to be boldly addressed, not tepidly addressed. And Canada has the capacity to do this, and we are not.
Thank you, John. We have not received any questions, so I think if there's any closing remarks for about, each person can have about a minute to make a closing statement, and then we will conclude after that. So, Senator McPhedran, is there anything you would like to add as we conclude?
I'd just like to underscore that it is International Human Rights Day, and we know that there are massive human rights violations occurring in many countries in the world. But Canada has a joint parliamentary statement committing us to take action. And we have made tentative steps to doing that. The time is now for a declaration that is clear, for resources, and for us to step up as a party under the Genocide Convention to make sure that the current case is as strong as possible, and in particular, the voices of Rohingya and the voices of Rohingya women and girls are heard in the International Court of Justice.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Senator. There is actually a question that's just come up. It's from the International Observatory for Human Rights, which is a media channel located in London, UK. Do you think if the outcome of the ICJ court finds in favor of the Rohingya, that it would mean that the Chinese government would be the next target for their treatment of the Uyghurs? If so, do you think this would impact UN members stepping up now as China takes up its seat on the Human Rights Council? John, Kyle, maybe you're best placed to answer those.
I'll just simply say that, first of all, in the light of any act, and not only commission of genocide, but for purposes of the prevention of genocide, the Genocide Convention compels parties to take action. The duty is to act in the light of where we think there's a genocide or where there's the prospect of it occurring, to take steps to prevent. So that needs to apply in general. It's not a matter of targeting any state. It's engaging with what's before our eyes or the risks that occur, because that's considered to be a threat to everyone. That's the lesson of the Holocaust and the whole idea of never again and so forth. But we also know, long established, that as the sometimes paraphrased statement that goes that the only thing needed for evil to take place is for good people to do nothing. What we know here is that there are 153 states parties to the Genocide Convention, and so far only 4 have actually expressed a willingness to act. The Gambia, which has acted, Canada and the Netherlands, which has stated it intends to act, and the Maldives, which has said it has a readiness to act also. Other states have declared, many states have declared that they believe there's genocide, so now we need to act. And if nobody does act, then we know that the lesson for others is that if this is inconsequential, if you can get away with genocide, especially in your face, if I may use that phrase, as in the case of the Rohingya, this is deeply disturbing for the rest of the world. I think there's no doubt in the case of China that, or in the case of many other situations, there's already been copycat elements of the steps taken by Myanmar regarding the Rohingya, the denationalization, the systematic persecution, the internments, and so forth. So, I think that is unfortunately giving a green light if we don't act. And anyhow, this is a matter for us. I want to underline, this is a matter for Canada and Canadians and any good people of good conscience, that you must act in the face of these kind of atrocities.
Kyle and then Aziza.
Sure. Just brief comment. There is the question coming about China. truth be told, there is an issue that there are certain states, authoritarian ones, that are getting much more aggressive and are trying to push back on human rights norms and regulations. We see the case with the Uyghurs with China. I remember at a public event, the former special envoy, Bob Ray from Myanmar, mentioned at an event at my university that he couldn't get a meeting with Chinese officials. They wouldn't want to meet with him to talk about this. So there is something deeper there that we have to be aware of. That doesn't mean that we can't take action and use the international mechanisms that are in place that we've agreed to and we've agreed to act on when this is the case. And just one last comment. The thing about Myanmar and the Rohingya is that this is really the first genocide to be incited on Facebook. We have numerous cases of Buddhist nationalist monks inciting violence, dehumanizing Rohingya. We have top-level military officials inciting violence against the Rohingya. So there's also an opportunity here to really kind of look at how we can transform some of this digital evidence, and we have to put pressure on social media companies that have not been willing to release a lot of it. But there's another element there that we could play, besides the political and pushing diplomatically at the International Court of Justice, but trying to find out ways to use this digital evidence that is now controlled by Silicon Valley to bring it to the table.
Aziza?
So when it comes to the International Court of Justice in China, one barrier is that China has a reservation to the provision of the Genocide Convention under which the case against Myanmar has been brought. And so as the Rohingya case is illustrating some of the problems and issues and limitations with the state-centric organization of the international system, those issues are only, if anything, exacerbated in the case of China, which has issued reservations to so many of the provisions, which would enable some accountability to be brought to bear for the genocide and other crimes being committed against the Uyghur people. However, there's contemplation of a case being brought forward at the International Criminal Court. So that's for individual criminal liability against Chinese officials on the same theory that the ICC case has been brought against some Myanmar officials, which is that crimes spilling over onto territories of states that are parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court may be subject to the court's jurisdiction. So there are some creative ways that we can deploy these international legal mechanisms, even in the face of state-centric formulations and structures of impunity. And when it comes to China and the Uyghurs, it's also very important to emphasize that the genocide of the Uyghurs, like the genocide of the Rohingya, but even more so, is sustained by an entire web of international economic relations. And so those may be perhaps even more effective in marshalling in order to ensure some kind of accountability and halt to the atrocities taking place. And so it's extremely important that we examine all of those economic ties with Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, with the forced labor that is occurring against the Uyghurs by the Chinese regime, in order to think about other avenues of exerting pressure on a regime that otherwise has immunized itself as much as possible from such influence.
Thank you very much, Aziza. We'll continue with closing remarks and we will conclude. So we have about a minute. Aziza, I will let you make any final remarks that you want to make if you have not said anything that you haven't been able to.
No, I have nothing further to say. Thank you,
Okay.
Fareed.
Okay. Alia, would you like to make a closing remark of about a minute? Your microphone isn't on.
I just wanted to emphasize that it is absolutely critical for Canada to speak out and to take bold action now. And the time of waiting has gone, and we must act now. Not only is it essential to stop this genocide from continuing, but it's also a reflection of Canada's credibility. You know, I think that we have no credibility if we cannot act in the face of open genocide. It is shocking, and it really is disgraceful.
Thank you very much, Alia. Kyle, would you like to make a final comment?
Just final comment for any Canadian citizen watching this. If you're concerned, write to your MP, contact your senators, send a tweet out to the foreign minister and to the Minister of Justice. Make your voice heard. We have a freedom and we have a democracy, and we can shift things if we speak up and demand action from our elected officials. So don't be afraid to do that.
Thank you, Kyle. John, final comment?
I have nothing substantively to add. Let me just say that in supporting Kyle's last remark, that I think it behooves us, it is our individual and collective responsibility benefiting from living in a free society to step up as a matter of conscience, but also in solidarity with the victims, to actually help them voice their demand that their situation be treated as it should be treated, and in all our collective interest. So do express yourself, please.
I'd like to thank all the panelists for their words and for the ideas that they have suggested, as well as for calling on the Canadian government to take the action which is legally obliged to under the Genocide Convention. I'd also like to thank the participants in the room who have joined us. This is the first time we're doing this, so maybe there will be future opportunities to do similar virtual media conferences. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time this morning to be here, and we will, of course, be seeing each other in different forums as we continue to work to try and seek justice for the Rohingya. And I know that from the Rohingya that I deal with, they are very grateful for all the time and effort that's been put in to help them with this cause of being seen as human, not just in Myanmar, but by the rest of the world. Thank you very much.